Testing.
Today is Monday, March 6th, 2023, and we will call the meeting to order at 5:32 p.m. Agenda item number 2 is to receive and discuss the fiscal year 2024 budget overview.
So good evening, everyone. I have 2 documents I want to share with you to begin our process. The first one is titled Budget for Next Year. This is a memo we've talked about with the Finance Committee, but it's gone out to our community recently, like within the last several minutes, just to share some thoughts with them about where we're at with our budget process. We have a reduction in funding this year from the state. And so there's going to be some tough conversations. And instead of people hearing things through grapevines or what other platform, we've shared this out publicly. So that's the first document I have for you. And it's built as a frequently asked questions model. And it answers or at least attempts to inform the following 8 questions. Funding is down, but why? What is different this year from the last few years? What about the money from the unfilled positions? Where does all the money go? What about the money from COVID relief dollars? How did we get here? What about next year and the year after? And how will this affect us? So I have copies for you, but again, they've been shared out publicly on different platforms and via email to staff and members of the community. If you want to just take one and sit down. Sure. I'll take it from Megan.
People in the audience.
Make sure you get all the community members. All right, so my plan for this evening is to essentially walk us through a status of where we're at. I want to emphasize that tonight is very much a starting point. There may be some numbers on here that grab the attention of members of our community and also all of you. We have a tough task with subsidy coming in lower from the state and the need of our students being as great as they have ever been. While also trying to be mindful of what we ask of our taxpayers is a tough task. And so I look forward to the work. We are trying to stay ahead of it in planning. We do have some reductions that we are almost prepared to share with you. We're looking at sharing some significant reductions on Wednesday. So shifting the model a little bit. In years past, we would go walk through each of the articles in the sections of the budget in the big binders, which you'll get on Wednesday. So you'll have that. It's portable. You could take it with you. So you could be looking at things line by line. But I think we're just looking at the reality of the financial situation. And so instead of waiting and doing conversations about wants and potential reductions at the end, we're going to get ahead of that a little bit and share some significant reductions on Wednesday, which I think will better inform the conversation as we go through the articles. So again, it's a little bit of a shift. We did talk about this with the finance committee, and they discussed, I think the sentiment around the table was, this is a Band-Aid that's going to hurt no matter what. For conversational purposes, I think it's better to do the overview tonight, and then on Wednesday, really lay out some potential reductions that can be considered throughout the process. Okay.
On the agenda for Wednesday, it mentions, oh, sorry, you're supposed to, he looked at me. On the agenda for Wednesday, it mentions articles that we're supposed to, I had thought we were going to get the binders and read them for Wednesday, but it's apparently not. We're going to get the binders on Wednesday and go over it fresh.
Yeah,
Okay.
so that was
Thank
the
you.
plan to do binders Wednesday. We're still going to go through those articles. We will still go through the books. I guess what I was trying to say is Wednesday, we're going to come in. We've had a lot of time to think of this. We learned of the ED 279 information back in January. We had shared that with you at a prior meeting with some concerning factors to it. So we really want to just start having the tough conversations sooner than later. I think it's important for us to be able to digest them all, but still go through the articles. Right, so the budget overview starts with an introduction. My intent is to go through the details of this, but not just try to read to you. So if you feel like you're being read to, please just tell me to stop and we can pause there. But I started with sharing information that, you'll have your binders here coming up. The city council also gets their binders, but they get a little further down the road after we've made some adjustments. Our draft budget will go through, obviously, a series of meetings in March. We meet twice a week. And then if we need additional meetings towards the end of the process, we have those penciled as if needed. And if we need them, we will certainly use that time. On April 11th, on March 20th, the city council will hear a presentation from me or us. And that will be followed by an April 11th item with the city council, where I will go to the city council and present the budget that you have approved to them. And potentially that could be voted on May 2nd. And then May 4th, we have a town hall scheduled, and that precedes the referendum, which is scheduled at this point in time for May 9th. So from an overall summary perspective, we want to walk through why we have some reductions and some of the fiscal realities that we have this year. But I also want to ground ourselves in that we need to plan for our students, particularly our most vulnerable in this process. And that second, we also have to be thinking of the weighing those, the cost of those needs and the cost to our community. On page 2 at the top, it starts with a list of items that we wanted to share around kind of like a status. So state funding is down this year for Lewiston, and I'll get into a fair amount more detail further down. We'll do an overview with detail of articles and cost drivers. So that will be part of that binder work that we do. The initial budget amounts will be decreased through a series of, I've used the word packages, but I'm not sure how to articulate it. But essentially, we've come up with things, starting with vacancies and some other items that none of it is easy to live without, given our school system and level of need. But without trying to play favorites or prioritizing too heavily on one position over another, that there will be some reductions. I also want to ask that if there, a couple years ago, we had a process of people wanting to add things back, and it became incredibly challenging. And so if you could be mindful of anything that you see, whether it's in the budget as part of a potential reduction, if you want to add it back, we have to be mindful that there's a cost to that. So the frame of mind I try to use is, if we're adding something back, what's coming out? And I'm not saying that that's a mandate, but we have to think in that lens, because we're going to have conversations about things that we all want, but we might not be able to afford at this time. Corrections to how items have been distributed across articles will be explained. So we have kind of an introduction, not that the camera can see them, but we have Adam Hansen, who is our controller and finance person, Bill Grant, who works closely with him, and Sue Williams, who's also very integral and part of this process. So they are here they'll help articulate, and also they do some fact checking. I don't know if you've ever seen shows online when someone talks a lot, like I am right now, and then they go, no, you're off by $1 million there, or things like that. So I have my fact checkers back there, and I invite them to come up to the podium at any point in time to correct me, and also to point out corrections in our budget process. I think that makes us better. So thank you all for your attention to detail. The resources that we need, we know are not going to be all inclusive, and we know that at the outset. Next piece down, I talked about how the mission, vision, and strategic priorities work has continued. That's out actually in survey form right now. We're gathering some feedback, but that's very close to being back before you for potential adoption or further edits. But I still like that scope of that series of questions, and it was about that presumption. And regardless of how hard our budget process might be, if we envision 3 years from now, we look around and see an amazingly successful school system, what are we seeing and how do we get here? And those are the things that we want to keep in mind. Themes that emerged in that process that we've maintained with our leadership team starting back in December, that we want to improve instruction systematically, improve our special education structure to improve programming, grow pathways to graduation, maintain equity, social, emotional, and coping skills development efforts, school safety, stability, and communication. Those aren't listed in priority. They're all very important to us. A little bit of history. Back in December, we met with our management team, which is essentially all of our principals and directors. And we set the stage for the budget, looking at those priorities, and told them, you can't add anything new this year unless you are taking something out to pay for it. And so this is kind of a lesson learned for me, but also a part of our funding situation. So if we just ask people, what do you need to meet the needs of our kids, the list gets quite long. And I think I remember my first budget cycle, we cut like $16 million worth of things before we brought it to you. And I think it was an eye-opener to me of the level of need that we have, pared it down with the reality of what we can afford. And so this year we said to people, knowing we had a reduction or a potential reduction, that if you want to have a position, something, you have to tell me what you're going to take out to do that. So one example might be, well, we have 2 ed techs that we don't use as much as we thought we would, but I'd like to have 1 additional teacher do this. And so that roughly in cost would equate out. So principals and directors have the ability to make those kinds of proposals. We also have the fact that I'm going to try to refer to all the COVID relief funds as either COVID relief funds or ESSER funds. So I'm sorry if I mix those two up. It's just so fluid in my mind, but that's all the money that has come to us in different waves throughout the pandemic. That is also sunsetting. So we've had a number of funds sunset already, We have essentially one remaining that will carry some positions through next school year in full, and then it will be no more. The only way in which we can extend that funding as of right now is if we have a construction project that is underway that was in part delayed because of COVID, essentially. And we will have that likely through a project, if not two. But the rest of those funds are, again, we apply for them, they approve them, they're in effect, and any changes would require us to reapply. The reality of those funds sunsetting shifts the dynamics of the budget process. For the last several years, we've been able to say, well, we'll take it out of the general fund, but we can use ESSER funds to pay for that. So that's a conversation that we can't use this year in that way. Actually, I think Member Damon said it well in an email back to me recently that this is the first time since the pandemic hit that we've had to have what I would consider real budget conversation, because we've had these other places where we can put things. Those places no longer exist. We still have work that we're doing with the Department of Justice around our ELL programming and work around language acquisition. And so even though we've taken a conservative approach to our efforts as of now, with how we started the budget with our leadership teams, how we sought out corrections and to reduce things that were no longer accurate, that landed as costs in our budget. Even though we've taken that very conservative approach, all of our contracts are in place. So teachers, ed techs, custodians, front end staff, they get their steps, they get their raises. Those are all collectively bargained. And whether you have a tight budget year or not, people have earned that, and the negotiations have happened. So when we look at things like last year, we talked about that $40,000 teacher minimum, and we had like this little bump from state funding, and there was a sense that maybe that was paying for the minimum. Well, that $40,000 minimum is in. It was part of the negotiations with our educators, and now the funding has been reduced. And so you can see the predicament. Bill articulated it well in our finance committee meeting that anything that we do, if you consider the reduction in funding with the kind of automatics, we're starting at a net loss. So any dollar you spend starting at a $1.3 million deficit is an ask to the local taxpayer for every dollar over a $1.3 million deficit. That's a big number to overcome. When we started to put all these different pieces together, there's some level of assuming assessed value increases in our community, and we talked to City Administrator Heather Hunter about that. And then the mill rate calculation all gets generated in connection to the valuation and what is the ask. And we definitely have some constraints this year. If the level of local funding from last year is maintained, this budget at its starts results in a $7.8 million shortfall. There's a massive number to overcome. We've not come into this unprepared. We knew this day was coming, and we have some things that we're prepared to share with you, but there certainly will be some tough decisions. Anything that we do above and beyond, because of the state reduction, will go directly to taxpayers. I've kind of said this a few times, but it's a different dynamic where some years we have a little bit of state funding increase, and then we're asking taxpayers for a little bit to match that level or to bring us up to where we'd like to be for the year. Because the state funding is lower, any additional is all local. And I think our community has started to express the concern that they have around taxes and the cost. So as we look at that, the only way we can bridge the gap between the money that we feel we need at the end of this process and the money that we have is a further reduction in expenditures or an increase in funding, be it state, local, or other. And I may mention this a few times. There are some bills out there that will increase state funding if passed, and then if appropriated, and then if signed by the governor. And so I'm hopeful about some of those things, but they won't happen before we have a referendum on this budget. And so I have been in communication with Heather at the city about the ways in which we might look at some of that funding if it should come to us later down the road. And I want you to keep that in the back of your mind from like a contingency kind of approach of what we might do if more funding should show up. I think the committee will be able to have a sense of the things they want to prioritize if they were to put things back, or what things they would do differently if more funding were to show itself. So some more detail around the costs are up. The projected health insurance increases, when you do the math on each position, are up $1.4 million. That's just health coverage. The overall salary increases are 3.1 million. So again, when we talk about that 1.3, that deficit, just raises is 3.1 million. The overall salary and benefit is 4.8. The remaining debt service, we still have some debt service for the expansion, but our debt service numbers are reducing, which is a good thing. I don't want to dive in the 279 form too much just now, but when we have debt service come off our books, it reduces the revenue that comes to us. And so that's a piece of reduced state funding. But if that money were to come in, it would have gone directly to pay for those projects. We still have some, as I mentioned, compliance costs with the Department of Justice, Department of Labor. We still are focused on improving special education structure and programming, although we have found with our new structure that you supported last year, we were able to identify some more things that we can save on this year. So I'm not saying that it's been a total wash, but things are moving in the right direction. We have stability. We're not looking at all the turnover, and that's improving every day. And there will be some cost savings in some of those positions. Overall inflation of the cost of goods. I've heard recently that it's 8 to 11% by household. The electric bill, the fuel bill, the food bill. The jokes go around the internet about eggs, being like a gift because they were so expensive. And I, all laughing aside, the cost of doing business of schools, from toilet paper to textbooks, all of the prices are up, all the shipping is up. Returning classroom and materials and supplies. So we moved a lot of things to balance our budget to ESSER funds. And with those funds sunsetting, we need to put them back in the general fund, or we won't have the materials in our classrooms to run our classes. And that's a $300,000 item. After school and summer programming, last year we were fortunate to get a reallocation and use ESSER dollars to support those programs. Again, between sunsetting and the shifting and the reallocation. We're not totally closed out of that at this point, but we're at risk there. And if we want that programming, we have to find a way to fund it. Labor market remains challenging right now. We've made a lot of strides. The apprenticeship piece is seeming to get some traction. That's a positive. But again, we need to resource that effort with our ability to coach and train people and have that internship become licensed and be viable. Our enrollments are down. I initially had thought it was more like 200, but we've had more people come back to school. It's less than 200 now, but for every student that doesn't come back, that isn't enrolled since COVID, or is being homeschooled or has gone elsewhere for whatever reason, that the range on a student subsidy in that effect is somewhere between $7,000 and $9,000. It varies on what the student's makeup is and what their level of need is and all of those things. But for every student that isn't here is a loss of subsidy. In addition, we're starting to look at things around enrollment, like if we're down 100 kids and there were 20 kids in a classroom, this is hypothetical, is that 5 classrooms that could be reduced and have the kids rescheduled elsewhere? So those are those very real conversations we've already started to have. We've identified around $3 million in potential reductions. We're not prepared to share those with you yet. We want to make sure that we have the accuracies and the numbers, but there will be significant reductions in the budget process. The draft budget is summarized on page 3, I believe, where we list out some different items, which I'll walk through. But again, just doing the budget, adding those raises, minimal add backs, Easter things that needed to go back. We came in at $105,753,517. That's less than 7%. Again, I'm going to emphasize, and in the memo that we're sharing here, it's in bold that we're beginning to identify potential reductions, and we know that there'll be reductions in this budget process. So this next section is where you see the description and the budget. It will show FY24, which would be next year, FY23, which we're living, and then the variances between the two. And so the local minimum tax in this ratio is 18,330,000. Last year was 17,174,000, and that's a 6.73% increase. Debt service, you can see that there's a negative bracket there because that's down. Again, that's a good thing. Additional local tax, what we don't have yet for a percentage is based on the rates for the tax, but you can see that 6.689 number, which is again a number that's far too big for our community. We'll have to work on that. And then you see the totals for the FY24 budget at 31,401,312, and then your overall variance with that, that's where you get that 7.8 or 33% change. Next line down, you see the state contribution, and you can see that in that particular line, it's reduced by 982,426, but that is only part of the story of our reduction. You'll hear me use different numbers around the reduction from the state, but below that, you can see some notes. The first note being that CTE, which is our Lewiston Regional Technical Center and related programming, got an increase of $430,000 in projected revenue for next year. That is large in part due to expanded programming in Auburn. So that is still a subsidy that comes here because it's a Lewiston Regional Technical Center program or programming. The problem with that, when you look at the bottom line, when I say negative 982,000, that $430,000 can only be used for technical programming. So it can't be used for special ed, regular ed, transportation, all the other things that we run in all of our different articles of our budget. So to me, that's an add back. So that's how I go from the 9 to the 1.3. There's some other variances in there that I feel strongly about, that really the loss in state subsidy is around 1.7 million from my calculations when I figure all the pieces. I also want to add that almost 1.5, it was $1.489 million last summer, came as an additional education fund to Lewiston. That money went to the city as part of our warrant article process. So Article 13, the last thing in our budget process that's voted on at referendum, it states that any additional funds received from the state will be used for tax relief. And so that funding goes to the state. It doesn't sit in the school coffers. But when I look at it and I think of the shortfall, and then I think of that 1.5, and it's kind of like that funding, if it made its way to the schools, we would be in a very different situation. So to build around that, we're looking at different language for Article 13 this year, more because the state has changed the way in which they're dispersing funding. So for each of the last 3 years, there have been additional funds passed out in July, which is after our referendum process. It's kind of a disadvantage for our taxpayers to not have that information before the referendum. So there'll be conversations around that article. Some other more detailed things. The economically disadvantaged factor was reduced from 0.2 to 0.15. And in our research of that, last year it was 0.2, the year before that it was 0.15. So the state went up in that for 1 year and then reduced it back. And our understanding is that was statute. One other change in a big district like ours, it adds up in a hurry, is the ratio for subsidy went from a 1 to 16 ratio for students to staff to a 1 to 17. So even that one additional student per staff, when you're a district our size, it reduces your subsidy significantly. As we look at our revenues, we have unexpended funds. So that's like that fund balance piece. I put in there as a placeholder that we would use the same as last year. And if we did that, that would be $5 million. That is sitting in our bank account. That's unexpended funds. But I want to dive into that a little bit because the unexpended funds piece has some history to it, and we're in a unique place because of the pandemic. Any dollar we use in fund balance any given year is money you either have to use again next year or find another space for it. And so if we use 5 million this year, well, let's say we get really tight in our budget, we say, hey, let's just use 7 because we can afford it. You can afford 7 million this year. You might be able to afford 7 million next year, depending on savings this year. But in year 3, you have to find $7 million that you don't have. And so to me, it's like mortgaging a house to where I can make the payments for 3 years and then I'm out of money. Like you have to generate income to continue that payment. And so we want to be really careful with fund balance. You'll see me deflect that a fair amount if it comes up in conversation, because I really, really worry about ever coming up to that conversation of we need 5 million to start and we have 0. That is a $5 million hole to start the conversation of a budget. We don't want to be there. That next line down is that total revenue again, that 105 million that I talked about. Estimated add to the tax rate. We don't know that yet because those numbers are being figured still. Actually wanted to have this conversation first. The city is ready. Heather Hunter at the city is ready to do those calculations. The next item down, you see from that set of revenue with our expenditures, an increase of that 6.6. And again, we'll be looking for some savings. If anyone is interested in looking at the ED 279, I know I've printed one and passed it to you, but if someone wants to look it up, there's a link here. When we share this electronically, that link will be active so people can click on that and go look. You can also look at prior years to find the trends of the different funding. Go to the next page where we talk about again, a little more detail about fund balance, which I just mentioned verbally. In our budgets, when we go through the budgets, you'll see other revenue, and that reflects Medicaid reimbursements, facilities rentals, and other reimbursable items. I know last year we talked a lot about the Medicaid reimbursement. We didn't have a structure set up for that to do it the right way, and we were leaving hundreds of thousands of dollars on the table. Those systems are getting up and running now, and so we're starting to see those revenues come in, and so we're pretty hopeful that will continue, and we'll be able to realize those revenues next year once that system is running at full speed. The proposed budget initially came in much higher than what we're talking about now, but we didn't feel it appropriate to bring. Actually, I personally struggled with bringing this number to you, knowing that we would need to have sharp reductions. I'm willing to fight for certain things, but I also think that we just have to be rational and mindful about what we're asking. That's why we've spent a lot of time leading up to today and Wednesday with potential reductions. Another mention of the extended school year and extended school day piece. Adam pulled a figure that it's roughly $351,000 for our district to run those items. So this is, you're talking 5 elementary schools, middle school, high school, next step, whether it's credit recovery, after school programming, all of those pieces, and summer school included. Health insurance, we talk about this every year, but for those who don't live it, especially watching online or listening, the insurance rates are not set usually until the later part of March. And so we have to budget within a kind of a frame. And so we budgeted that at 12% this year. Last year, we budgeted that at 12%, and it came in at, I think, 4 or something really low last year. Do you remember, Adam? What? Oh, it was less than 1% last year. And so the year before that, it was 0. And I think 3 years ago, it was 0, if I remember correctly. So one thing I know about insurance, and I don't mean this to make a jab at anyone, but if it's 0, 0, and then 0.0 something, at some point, it's going to go back up. The other factor that goes into that is people are living their lives again. So I think during the pandemic, when people were kind of staying more in their own bubble, there were less major injuries, there were less elective surgeries, there were less medical screenings and things of that nature. Again, not good things, but they contributed to a low insurance rate. And so we budgeted for that. If that comes in lower, we can realize those savings and we'll relay that information to you. Transportation, as you know, we still are on almost all days making cancellations because of the shortage. We did budget for the full complement of buses. It is our hope and intentions that our buses are running their full routes at full capacity and that we can stop cancellations. I did contemplate budgeting less because of the trend, but I think the trend is looking upward and we're hopeful that will improve. Adult education they're projecting a small increase, about 3%, and that's really just around staffing and contracts. They do, however, have their own fund balance. Adult education functions separately of our other articles. There's lots of reasons for that in their funding stream, but because of that, they have their own kind of nest egg of fund balance, and they're going to use that to cover any cost increases this year. So reduction factoring, again, City Administrator Heather Hunter shared that $22,144 equals approximately 1 cent based on our valuation. And so the way I like to build this out for people, if you're starting to think ahead about, well, just how much might we reduce this proposal? 2.2 million is $1 on the tax rate. So once we have the tax rate, that will give us a sense of that. 1.107 is 50 cents. 553,000 is 25 cents. Have to point out, and again, it's not overly comfortable, and this is why I messaged our staff and community, but staff and benefits represent approximately 70% of our budget. It's a reality. And if we're going to make the reductions that we're talking about making, it will be a reduction in positions, amongst other things. Again, we've already identified over $3 million in possible reductions that we will vet and bring to you. None of those reductions are easy. However, as we navigate the fiscal waters that we have in front of us, we'll provide all we can for our students and stay fiscally responsible. The very bottom part here is an enrollment summary, and you can see the enrollment, and that is by grade, by school, with totals at the end and a grand total at the bottom, respectively, by grade and as a whole. And right now, our enrollment, again, this was pulled today, not necessarily the number the state used to create the ED 279, but was 5,375 students.
Seems.
So we have 1.3 and 7.8. So are we really looking for 9.1?
No, the 7.8 is the
Total.
that's the big number.
Thank you.
Thank you. I had asked this in the finance committee meeting, but I just want to bring it up here at this meeting as well. For enrollment summary for a comparison of the last few years of where we're at and also what other districts are possibly dealing with, because I know that conversation generally comes up from the public and wondering where our enrollment is in accordance to others and funding and all of that. So I did ask for that in our finance meeting. I asked for something else too, and I forgot what it was.
Yeah, I know you had asked about the comparisons, and we actually had a spreadsheet about that.
Yes.
And so just putting some things out there, and there's a lot of factors to this. So some districts may see, actually Auburn was a good example. So on a piece of paper, they have an increase of $1.3 million, but in reality, much of that is debt service because of their new school and projects. And so they've actually seen a reduction. But other comparisons like Portland, they're at a $2.4 million reduction. Westbrook, which is another comparable district to ours, size-wise, and they have a growing diverse demographic, they're down 1.15. And so there's a lot of comparable districts out there. You'd have to get at what their debt service is, because if they built something recently with state dollars, it can inflate the number versus what is actually available for them to use in their budget to do the work of teaching and learning. But there's a whole lot of superintendents in Maine that are just really struggling with the numbers that have come down from the state. I could see it being a tighter year, not knowing the economic future post-pandemic, potential, slowdown and all of those things. I didn't anticipate a reduction at the state level this year. I knew it would be hard locally, but I didn't anticipate over $1 million in local reduction. As for the multi-year enrollments, we'll get a list for you. We can bring that back for sure.
Ms. Bowden?
Thank you. Something else discussed in the finance meeting that I just thought it was good information maybe for the public. When you kind of touched upon how inflation right now for most families, we're feeling between 8-11% in our households. I think that's the national average. With our budget, the way that it is before cuts, we're looking at 7%. So I guess it's lower than the national inflation rate. So it's kind of good to hear, but it's still crazy. So I wanted to ask you if you wouldn't mind sharing publicly what you're kind of aiming for percentage wise, as far as what you see our increase when we're done all of our work.
Yeah, so I've had the fortunate experience of living this in my head for a couple months now, and I had a target in my mind. Can our community support 4%? The challenge to that is the state being down, and so I don't know if 4% is where we need to get to, or if it needs to be beyond that. I think that we're working hard to get to that kind of area, and certainly would love feedback from the committee of where do you see us getting to. It doesn't necessarily have to be tonight, but we would love some direction around what is that number you think you can support bringing forward. And I'm also mindful that 8 to 11% at someone's home, this, while it's a 7% number, so it's not totally irrational, it would be on top of that 8 to 11% at everyone's home. And so that's heavy on our minds.
Ms. Hurd?
Thank you. I'm hoping that maybe by sending, I just got the text at the start of the meeting. And as we go forward, that we can get the word out there about the referendum, because I feel like we never have a great turnout from our local community when it comes time to vote on our budget. So I'm hoping maybe by you starting early and hopefully more people will tune into meetings or come to meetings, or we can blast it wherever we can. But I think getting the word out just to get more people out and voting is also a good thing too this year that we should work towards.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think in budget years where we can move things to Easter or, adjust as needed, obviously support for the budget is one thing, but in years where it's going to be incredibly tough, I think you and I and voters will benefit from people participating in the process. We did share a calendar and schedule of where and when the meetings will be at the bottom of the letter that was shared out publicly. Some meetings will be here, some at Connors because of availability. But if you pull into this building and you don't see anybody here, or you don't see a meeting in the back room, then we're across the way. So we try to keep them close in case somebody had the wrong spot.
Ms. Bowden?
Thank you. I guess I wanted to ask Ms. Scott a question on a city council perspective. Do you have any feeling from your fellow city councilors what they would be comfortable with as far as a mill rate increase? Nothing yet?
In all honesty, no, not
Okay.
yet. And we'll be starting our budget overview next week on the 14th. So we'll be starting that process and that conversation. As soon as I do, though, and any conversation around percentages, I'll definitely bring it back.
what do we know about the reason the state legislature fund formula changed? Do we know anything about that? That you can share?
All I can kind of narrow it down to is, just like us, as we go through this, we're gonna be talking about, transportation and this and this and this and facilities and regular ed and special ed. State's doing the same thing with their budget process, and they're saying, education, this is your allocation. And I think they did the best that they could. I know that last year there was some unrest amongst communities around the disadvantage number going up to 0.2. I don't know if that was a cause to drop it back to 0.15. But in a community like ours, where we have more economically disadvantaged families, we would see an increase there, but other districts would see a decrease. And so the factors are always back and forth. There was an election, and I think that there were some things that played into that. Again, I'm hopeful that new legislation will help communities like ours get a little more money to do the work of educating our kids. But we won't realize that until it's beyond the referendum. And I'll answer any other questions anyone may have, but that's all I had to share tonight. And then Wednesday, binders. And like I said, I think the feedback from the finance committee was, if you have those potential reductions, let's just get after it. If that's okay with the committee, then we'll talk about the articles on the schedule and potential reductions.
Any last questions, comments? Yes, member Damon.
Just sort of from a procedural standpoint, sometimes I know these budget meetings and hearings can go on for quite some time. It's going to be a long month, and I would propose maybe we said, if it gets to be 8 o'clock, 2.5 hours of budget stuff is, I have the tendency to get pretty foggy brained after about 2.5 hours of number crunching. I would opt that if we're done with an article, but there's still one on the list, if it gets to be 8 o'clock, then we just say, okay, that just gets pushed. I mean, these budgets twice a week and continuing the entire month, it gets really tiring, I guess, and that's partly maybe is my age. But it would seem like that we probably, if everyone is in agreement, we get to 8 o'clock and say, well, we've still got one more topic. Well, it's a new topic. Let's start fresh, because I think we end up with more. I feel like I get more out of it when I'm fresh, rather than if it's, we've had some of these in the past that have gone on till nearly midnight, and that's not, I certainly hope that's not going to happen. At least not from my perspective. So I just throw it out there as maybe a procedural thing, just to try to keep it so that we're all focused on what it's going to be tough, but there's a lot to discuss here. I can see that. And
so I don't get a vote necessarily in this kind of procedure, but I could absolutely support it. I think the hard work, much of the hard work has already happened behind the scenes. And I think it's about presenting you with those different options and those hard choices and trying to rationalize why that's on the list, which will be impossible at times, but we'll do our best. But I do think we can give you the list and share our rationale for what things are there and move forward. I do find that when we get to that 8:30, 9 o'clock, as we also have to turn it around, especially on the Mondays for Wednesday, to have things, I've already asked about, pulling that enrollment list together. And I know it's a small thing, but some nights it turns into 10, 15 things that you got to track and try to get back to answer questions. So if we don't go so late, that might make that work a little more clear, and that you get the answers you're looking for instead of us being here till 11 and we didn't have time to get the answers or couldn't remember all the questions that were asked.
Does anyone want to kind of give a thumbs up, thumbs down if you're in favor of wrapping things up at a reasonable time? Good. Okay. Member Scott.
And if I can, I would just recommend that if we're going to do that and there are questions asked, and let's put our questions as well as talking about it here, possibly in an email, so that there's can be that reminder and it can remind all of us. If you have a bunch of questions, it probably wouldn't hurt to, get that in an email so that we can reference that ourselves back and make sure that we get those answered.
And as we're not going to be able to review the books before Wednesday's meeting, but moving forward, we can kind of look ahead with the agenda and plan. So if you think you might have questions on a certain thing, preparing ahead of time for that would be helpful, to sending the questions ahead of time. So we have more turnaround time for staff to get the answers back for us.
I would also say that while I know we can't deliberate things offline, not that we do, but if you have questions as you look through the binder, feel free to send them along to us, and we can be trying to get those answers maybe even before a meeting, if that's something that's on your mind, or try to be prepared to answer it as best we can when we do come in. I think that's what Linda was alluding to. Feel free to send them, but I will also, like when I get that enrollment information, I'll send that to you so that you have that. If there are questions about it, feel free.
Jake, in looking at the current enrollment numbers that you gave us, is it your impression that we're going to start to see a decline in the number of total students? Each of these classes appears to be getting slightly smaller as we go back.
So there's a culmination of things that, yeah, the classes are a little smaller. I don't see a big decline, but I think that we might trickle a little bit and then reach a plateau. I think the thing right now for us in Lewiston is housing. And so I think that our enrollments won't grow again unless some housing things shift. I don't see that in the immediate future, but there's some things. But there's other factors in play that include when COVID happened, there were pods that were developed of kids getting homeschooled. And some of those folks have stayed with that model. There were some students who felt like they excelled learning online, so they've enrolled in online schools that exist that are accredited. And so we are seeing a reduction. We also know there's some kids that just stopped doing school or moved and never let us know, because how did you do that in the pandemic when you couldn't go to school to say we were leaving, and those kinds of things. So I know that the enrollment piece is a factor. I don't feel today that I'm concerned about it over the next 5 years, but I do think it's absolutely a factor. It does reduce our subsidy. But I think if we are smart about our staffing, then we should be okay.
If there's no further discussion, does someone want to make a motion to adjourn?
I would like to make a motion to adjourn.
Thank you. Would someone like to second that? Okay. All in favor? It's unanimous. Thank you.